Fallen Order was average with its gameplay design, and it doesn't have a lot in its gameplay design, especially in comparison to the PS2 version of The Force Unleashed. It doesn't have a lot of attack moves or force abilities, or even boss fights, and it basically had a simplified Dark Souls with none of the RPG mechanics, or even the same level of interconnectivity that made that work so well, having a simplified combat of Dark Souls-like gameplay, while doing nothing new with it, just the basics of combat, which is boring. I came from Episode 3 of the game, in the Force Unleashed PS2 edition, so when you come to Survivor, they actually added new moves, mechanics, gameplay options, and boss fights, and even more, even making the level design open-ended. This is brilliant and incredible and unexpected. You can use a pistol, thus separating it from Dark Souls and everything else, taking the combat design of Dark Souls and simplifying it to have a streamlined combat system. The combat system is very simple, especially in comparison to what inspired the combat like Dark Souls, or in comparison to the Force Unleashed PS2 version. It's so average, taking the fundamentals of Dark Souls combat and doing nothing new or original with it. The combat gets stale over time, because it's a combat system that many have already seen replicated, and it doesn't do it in a unique or new way. When you see The Force Unleashed, the game has multiple attack moves. It might not have a super large amount, but it's a decent amount, just enough to flesh out its gameplay mechanics, taking inspiration from Star Wars Episode 3, the game, and expanding on it, having multiple force abilities and attacks. It's incredible, giving you freedom and versatility during gameplay. You come over to Jedi Fallen Order, what force abilities do you even have? Oh wow, force push, and very few force abilities. Force abilities are not just small in amount in the game, but in the Force Unleashed, these abilities were mind-blowing, changing the gameplay around you. The Force abilities in Jedi Fallen Order barely changed the gameplay design at all, making this average on a fundamental level. The problem with Jedi Fallen Order is that the game is average. It takes the Dark Souls formula and doesn't do anything unique with it. Even its interconnected design and levels, although these levels look gorgeous, it is not fully interconnected into one world. It's actually split into multiple linear worlds, which is not as incredible as what Dark Souls did, and yet it used Dark Souls' formula. These levels are linear in comparison to the outstanding interconnectedness of Dark Souls. Also, Dark Souls is an action RPG at heart. However, Jedi Fallen Order is mainly an action game at heart, so it doesn't have any action RPG mechanics like Dark Souls did. It's more fun to play Dark Souls because of this. There's even more bosses as well. Yes, not only is the gameplay disappointing because force abilities and other methods of play are far and few between, but the game also has a lack of boss fights. There's only a very few minuscule of bosses, making the game's overall gameplay loop disappointing. In Dark Souls, there's so much content, so many boss fights. In The Force Unleashed, there's so many force abilities, and so much going on in its gameplay design. These abilities greatly affect the gameplay, making it worth it when you skill into it and use it. The abilities are just not enough of an impact to make them worth skilling into. I ended up hogging my points for a long time out of the sheer fact that they didn't have enough of an impact upon playing. How disappointing. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and I'll admit the story is pretty decent here, with a decent amount of character chemistry, backstory, and interactions. The gameplay is everything, however. It's just so average. There's nothing about it that stands out from the previous Star Wars, like Jedi Outcast, aside from having combat with a decent amount of feel and movement like Dark Souls. That's good, but it doesn't have enough to flesh out its gameplay design and level design, as it has segments in its level design that are mainly just cutscenes, so platforming is quite limited. In The Force Unleashed, there were tons of levels with great platforming. In Jedi Fallen Order, look at the level design, the platforming. There's just not a lot going on in that department. There are a few things you can do throughout the game design, but it just wasn't enough, especially in comparison to games like Jedi Outcast or The Force Unleashed. Even the lightsaber combat, in comparison to Jedi Outcast, Freedom, or The Force Unleashed, fleshed out gameplay design. This is so disappointing. I cannot stress enough how disappointing this is. This game is a letdown of epic proportions for being average on a fundamental level. Like another artist out there pointed out, content creator artist White Light. Content creation is art. Another creator out there stated it was fundamentally average, and this is true unfortunately. Jedi Fallen Order doesn't do enough new with its gameplay design, taking aspects of Dark Souls and not fleshing it out or making it its own gameplay in some way. making it like it's an average to be expected action game. And since Dark Souls is so popular, let's capitalize on its popularity and utilize its combat, but then do nothing new with its combat system, keeping it quite simple and not utilizing anything to flesh out its combat or gameplay design. You can parry, that's cool. Okay, you can use a few force abilities that have a minor impact on gameplay, and that's literally it. Once you level up, like I did, I even played on Grandmaster. I got that into it because I was curious about the newest Star Wars game. It's Star Wars, dude. Star Wars is my life. It's everything. And it's everything to an entire world, to an entire cultural medium. So when a new game comes out, guess who's first in line to see it? I will admit, however, that it looks like the sequel, Jedi Survivor, looks insane. I didn't expect this. I didn't know what to expect upon seeing the game, but I'll admit, it doesn't just look good. It looks like a huge improvement, and it might be one of the best Star Wars games in a long time, or even ever made, as they actually fleshed out the level design and combat plus more, which is crazy. That's amazing! However, the first romp leaves much to be desired, unfortunately. This game is so disappointing, average, platforming, that doesn't have a lot fleshing it out. Having cutscenes in the platforming that feel like they take you out of the experience instead of having great platforming. Puzzles that are okay, I'll admit. They weren't easy, but that's good. Puzzles are actually a good gameplay mechanic, so they do have those. But the movement and platforming of levels is so boring. It has no amazing platforming setups or placements to keep it fleshed out and fun to platform. When you see these worlds, they are limited. Linear is good, but limited is not. There's not much fleshing out its level design. These levels have nothing fleshing it out, and very minimal, if any, platforming, making traversing through each level so boring. They may be interconnected, but they are all split into different levels. It's all linear, and all separate levels. They are all interconnected, they are all separate. Dark Souls never separated you into different levels. There was just one level, and it was basically the entire game. It was that interconnected. Now, I'm not saying you have to be as interconnected as Dark Souls, but you could at least flesh out the platforming and level design to not only separate yourself from Dark Souls, but to make traversing each level more engaging and fun. It's boring, and every level feels virtually identical from each other. Aside from the beautiful, unique artistic direction, these worlds look beautiful and gorgeous, some amazing worlds in the Star Wars universe. Also, the game lets you do what you did in The Force Unleashed in this aspect, as it lets you choose the world you wish to land in. That's also cool. The combat feels smooth. It feels good to attack and dodge. This feels so nice and so smooth. The animations are gorgeous and it feels good. But that's really it, good, and once you attack, that is as far as it goes. It doesn't add any new attack moves. Aside from the double lightsaber blade, you end up getting that from its own list of attacks. However, it's the only way to have any other attack moves in the entire game, making the combat stay the exact same the entire game, making it boring and repetitive to deal with, especially if you've already played Dark Souls, which had more fleshed out gameplay design and RPG mechanics and bosses, so it gives an incentive. Here, there's no incentive, as the combat is similar to what you already experienced with Dark Souls. No RPG mechanics, as there's nothing fleshing out its gameplay design. Limited levels. They're all limited. Linear is okay, but limited is not. Since they're limited, it has very little, if any, platforming. Man, this game is so average on a fundamental level. There's literally barely anything separating it from other action games, to Dark Souls, to other games like this in general, or even other Star Wars games. This game makes me return to Dark Souls, where there was so much fleshing out its gameplay design, and there's RPG mechanics, and tons of boss fights that are satisfying and engaging. Here, I'm bored in comparison to Star Wars games, in comparison to other action RPGs, that not only redefined the genre, but did something engaging and even entertaining with its gameplay design, like Nier Automata, or of course, Dark Souls. These games do a fantastic job of keeping the audience engaged by fleshing out its gameplay design. When a gameplay design is fleshed out, people are engaged and find multiple means of enjoying the experience. They don't feel limited to just one thing. When the gameplay design is not fleshed out, you feel like you're doing the exact same thing at all times, with limited bosses as well. This adds to that feeling even more. It's unfortunate, but this game is just okay. And that's not bad, it's just boring. Man, I'm so disappointed with this game. It just doesn't do anything new or engaging with its gameplay design, making this game average. taking the Dark Souls formula and not really adding much to it, making it seem like they just used the combat system just to capitalize on Dark Souls formula because it's the new thing that people find appealing these days. That's frustrating to Star Wars, for Star Wars to go with Dark Souls formula when they had games like Star Wars Episode 3 and The Force Unleashed that had their own formula, and it worked quite well. So when you take Dark Souls, it just becomes average because they don't even take the aspects of Dark Souls that make it so compelling, like interconnected level design, or a singular entire level, an entire map, not split into multiple levels. And of course, action RPG mechanics. Hell, even multiple boss fights. Barely any of this, and barely any bosses. And no action RPG mechanics. Man, so boring. Now I miss The Force Unleashed. Not just boring, but average on a fundamental level. Now, here goes the fundamentals of combat. You can attack, and these look smooth and gorgeous, admittingly. You can also dodge and roll, and even counter and parry. It's so satisfying parrying in this game. I cannot lie about that. You can also block incoming attacks. Now, the combat works in this way. This is basically the entirety of the base combat system. I'll admit the story is quite good. It even develops the main character, and what happens in the story even plays out into the gameplay and voice quotes. As he goes through depression throughout the game, since Order 66 happened, he eventually starts developing as a character, and what he goes through as he changes actually plays out into the gameplay. So you'll hear a difference in voice quotes from the beginning of the game to the middle, showing his character changing. It actually plays into the gameplay, and it's a great detail I noticed. They did a fantastic job with that. You see, Jedi Fallen Order has a fundamental problem. You see, it took from Software's combat in some regard. However, it didn't add any unique elements to this formula where Dark Souls has RPG design behind its combat system, and there's loot and gear for your troubles, not to mention multiple boss fights. This game is mainly action-based, so aside from the dual-bladed lightsaber, you don't get new gear, weapons, and loot. You also don't have that many mainline boss fights, especially in comparison to something like Dark Souls, which has many satisfying boss battles. Jedi Fallen Order is like if you took the Star Wars universe and took the Dark Souls combat formula and utilized it without adding anything original behind it. Imagine a Shadow of Mordor, which uses Arkham's free-flow combat system, which is the duplicate of Batman Arkham without any of the cooler elements that made that game work. No, instead Shadow of Mordor decided to add a unique nemesis system, so the whole world reacted to your actions and death around you. The free-flow combat was not only heavily modified, but there was even a bit of gear, and they eventually added RPG loot and gear in its sequel. They also added some unique attack moves and modified the free-flow combat to further separate it from Arkham. Jedi Fallen Order is like the bare bones of Dark Souls, with little modifications to give it its own separate identity. So Fallen Order didn't do much with its combat design, and lacked a lot of identity in the process. So Jedi Fallen Order didn't do much with its combat design, and lacked a lot of identity in the process. It also doesn't have the best platforming, and a lot of it is just quick interactive cutscenes, with no gameplay immersion or movement, or testing out gameplay mechanics, making it underwhelming unfortunately. However, it has a good base combat system. The attacks feel smooth and refined, the movement is really good, and the effects look outstanding, so there are good aspects behind Fallen Order's combat design. And this is what I'm laying down about Jedi Fallen Order. And this was Tarragon. Thank you for watching.